But going into something completely different, some people might remember Typing the Dead. It was an old keyboard adaptation of House of the Dead 2 for the PC. There's a game that reminded me a lot of it there on the show floor called Rock of the Dead, where players used a guitar and played chords and sequence of notes on the guitar in order to shoot zombies and deflect attacks. I had the opportunity to play it a little bit, and while at first progressing through the level is really interesting to be able to quickly hit some keys and some strums to kill enemies, exploring a rather bland art style, while all the same acceptable for what I was playing, I found that overall, as more enemies got on screen, it was harder to focus on one enemy, because you would hit a single note and it might respond to 3 or 4 enemies, so they'd all pop up, and it's just kind of a sensory overload visually. There was no focus in it like you'd see in a rail shooter.
Yeah, it looked okay, but I think a few things that really bothered me was, like, firstly, the music while you're strumming does not go along with the music. It's kind of like every time you go ahead and strum the thing, it sounds like a gunshot. I want to hear you rocking out and stuff, and I didn't get that from what I was hearing on the game. And that, and also, they had blood in the game. And you know what? I would usually go ahead and say that's good for a zombie game, but since this is more of like a Rock of the Dead, I want to see your like guitar going ahead and shooting lightning bolts out of it and killing zombies more than having blood in this. Because if you have completely removed kind of like the blood aspect from this, you could put this to a lot more of a broader audience. It could be almost an E-game for that point. But it seems like the blood is kind of like attack on. I'm like, yeah, you kind of need it for a zombie game to a certain extent, but in this point, I think the exception would be trying to make a wider audience and a better acceptance.
Yeah, it seemed like overall the theme was set as a corny zombie movie, but they failed to recognize the benefits of applying rock themes, rock music to the game as well. They just used the rock and roll controller with an existing zombie movie, and it creates this detached experience.
Yeah.
For people who are reminiscent of games from the old TurboGrafx 16, Bonk is a really awesome title. This back in the day of 16-bit era games, game developers always wanted to try to make this iconic game character to progress both games and platforms forward. And with the TurboGrafx, it was Bonk. Now we're seeing from Hudson a Bonk game being made for the PSN and the Xbox Live Arcade, and you and I had an opportunity to play it. Let me get your thoughts first of what you thought of it.
I thought it was a really fun, very unique platformer. Instead of it being kind of like traditional Mario style, where basically you either just jump on the characters, you got a sword that you swing, this one, you use your head, literally. You go ahead and you jump up and you like smash headfirst into your enemies, or you try to headbutt them with your enemies, and then you have other fun abilities and all these kind of interesting mechanics you can do. And it really kind of showed itself as being a very unique and special platform.
Yeah, I really liked how they played off of 2 players that could play simultaneously. You could hit enemy up, you could start juggling them in the air to get bonus points, you could freeze enemies, use as blocks to help each other progress along. And I even saw where in midair, if you're hitting your attack just right, you can kind of bounce each other up and down on the ground. It had a lot of this cooperative, cohesive feel to the game that's missing from some cooperative platformers, but this definitely had it. And the mixture of that, the combination of different power-ups like the freezing ability, fire ability to shoot fire, and this kind of prehistoric / steampunk theme really makes it something interesting to play.
Yeah.
Now, for anyone who's played Magic the Gathering, they've seen a couple titles come out for the consoles the past 5 years. We've seen Magic the Gathering Online. There's some old PC titles back in the 90s.
Yeah, Battlegrounds.
Yeah. There's even now a tactics game coming out for the PSN, or I'm sorry, for the PlayStation 3 eventually, but right now the PC. And you had an opportunity to talk to one of the game designers.
Yes, it's going to be a very interesting game. It's going to take Magic the Gathering, and instead of it being like the raw card game like Planeswalkers, this is going to be an aspect of it that hasn't been even like done yet. It's going to be almost kind of like a Final Fantasy tactics game where you're going to go ahead and have a board and all your players on it, and you basically spawn your players on the board and you kind of use them for tactical advantages. And it's a very interesting idea, I think.
Could you elaborate a little bit on some of the adaptations that the designer talked about going from the card game to the tactics game?
Yes, they're going to go ahead and adapt a lot of what the card game had to this by kind of changing a few things. They're going to have it that you're going to have abilities to go ahead and move your characters faster and stuff. So it's still keeping very close and grounded to the card game, but they're kind of making it a little bit more dynamic and interesting by making it all like this turn-based game, and it's going to be very interesting.
I thought it was interesting how they adapted the mana system to the game. Normally in Magic, you get, as you draw cards out of your hand, you'll have a handful of mana cards. And you can lay them down and you turn them in order to play spells and play creatures. But in this game, since you don't have cards physically, you're instead rewarded a certain amount of mana each turn. And then these are spent in order to spawn new enemies on the map or in order to cast spells. And furthermore, the way they limited the number of enemies on screen in order to keep the board from getting filled up is they gave you 5 slots to play enemies. And from what it looked like on the GUI and what the designer was saying, it looked like you could open up more creature slots as you leveled up your Planeswalker. So give and takes like these are rather interesting. And questions were asked about what happens if you wanted to run a deck that had a lot of very weak enemies, like 20 or 30, versus running 2 or 3 very powerful enemies. And it sounded like they had to, that limitation still stands even with strategies like this, just because they need to adapt it to a miniatures game, essentially. I thought that trade-off was interesting, personally.
And the great thing about this game is that it will be free. That's what they did go ahead and push on it. It's going to be a free game. It's going to be online. You're going to be able to get your first starter pack, and you'll be able to play for nothing. And that's really nice.
Yeah, and the funding system was also interesting because although it's free, one must buy boosters in order to get any real interesting creatures or spells. What they're relying on is players to spend money to get these digital download randomized packs similar to the cards itself of creatures and spells. You get 1 rare, several uncommon, several common, and add those to your collection and then play those online. And these come from the same guys that have made at SOE that have made several other prominent online games. The lobby system and player community systems are also going to be very robust.
Yeah.
Finally, one really big surprise was the reveal of Darkspore. Now, anyone who looked at the Comic-Con schedule about a week or 2 before Comic-Con will notice that the Darkspore session was labeled as a new game reveal by Maxis, not revealing it as Darkspore. And then as it got closer to Comic-Con, the Darkspore trailer was revealed, and they showed just a little bit of concept. But in the session itself, they actually went over a lot of the gameplay mechanics, a lot of the characters, and the story itself. Darkspore is actually going to be an action RPG very similar to Diablo, a top-down isometric view going across the 3D environment. Players can choose one of 3 collected heroes and switch between them actively during gameplay, and they essentially play as spore-type creatures. The player starts out with one base hero and has to go through and collect other heroes as the game goes on, and then they can customize them inside the creature editor, which I thought really interesting. Players can get loot like weapons and armor, similar to Diablo again, where there's colors and adjectives used to denote the rarity of the item. And also to further mix it up, you can get the almost identical looking item, same name, same color, but different stats in order to further mix it up. And they had 3 classes, one being kind of a rogue type, which has high dexterity, high dodge, but very weak, a caster type, which does range attacks and spells, and of course your beefy tank type, which is all strength-based. The mixture of this, the theme being a futuristic sci-fi, and if one looks at the GUI, it looks very reminiscent of Diablo 2, and the fact that multiplayer is going to be online, cooperative, 4 players, makes this a really interesting title that I'm going to keep my eye on now. The attendance to the game itself for the session was very short, was very small. Only about half the seats got filled, so I'm worried about their PR department not doing their jobs correctly. The word's not really getting out about Darkspore, but I'm certainly going to buy it.
Yeah, it's a very surprising title, especially going with the Spore title in the name, just because of the reception that the original Spore title got.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be something I have to fight with. Well, that's it for our coverage of Comic-Con 2010. On top of putting this footage up, we'll also be releasing some supplemental footage, including gameplay footage and a couple developer interviews with games like Dead Space 2 and Splatterhouse. So take care and please leave comments.